EPL's Q&A session. My name is Danny Pozuelo and I'm one of the partners at EPL. I wanted to come in and try to answer some of your questions because I'm going through a similar scenario with my wife and I've been talking to the rest of her class and to some college officials, and I have information and expertise that might come in handy for the questions you've been asking us, right? So let's go ahead with your first question. Should I continue studying for the SAT even though most schools are now test optional? Well, first things first. I wouldn't say that most schools are test optional. I would say we're far from seeing most schools go down the test optional path. I do believe that 900 schools out of the more than 4,000 that are accredited in the US are test optional, and that's important. And right now there is a trend, at least a debate that's gaining some force now in the States, and some important advocates towards having, I would say, more access to education and fewer hurdles or fewer barriers, right? At least for people who consider standardized tests as barriers, right? Now, in order to answer this question, I would analyze the policies that schools are implementing. Let's take Tufts. Tufts was one of the first schools to come out with a public announcement that it was changing its admissions policies for the next 3 years, and that starting with the class of fall 2021, it would allow students to decide whether they wanted to send their scores or not. That means that the school at least will analyze students' applications with scores or without scores with a holistic approach and in a contextual way, meaning that they will consider your context. In order to talk about context, let's consider what Harvard's doing. Harvard took away the subject test requirement, and in particular for cases where there is financial hardship, right? So let's consider those two scenarios and think about how that applies to us, the international students. If you think that limited availability of test dates was a hindrance to your process, then yes, use the test optional path, I would say. But if there aren't that many barriers and if you didn't have that many difficulties, do consider preparing and taking those exams, because you will show to schools that you're willing to go the extra mile and you're willing to do the additional work. And that's usually a great indicator of success for your college career. Let's go to the second question. Your second question is, what can I do to stay motivated and focused without knowing SAT or other test dates? For the time being, we know that SAT, ACT, TOEFL, and some other exams have been canceled, right? And it is difficult to stay on path when you can't really set a timetable or a timeline for those particular goals. But it is important to be ready for what's happening, right? Let's take March 14th. Back on the 14th of March, the SAT was canceled, but a few days before the exam, the College Board announced that it had come up with an additional test date on March the 28th. And that's, I would say, not even 2 weeks after the original exam was programmed, right? So let's consider that. Right now, we have to be patient. The only thing is, the only certainty that we have right now is uncertainty. And if you ask me, that's great practice, because life is uncertain and what we're experiencing right now might prepare us for what's to come. So use that as a springboard to finding the motivation to say, look, luck is when preparation meets opportunity, or when opportunity meets preparation. Either way you want to see it. What I'm saying is you have to be ready for when the time comes, because the College Board, I don't think, wants to lose the battle against standardized testing. So it will come up with additional test dates for its students. And at that point, you won't be able to use the excuse like, oh, I didn't know, I couldn't prepare. No, you want to be ready for it, because that's the type of student that a school really wants in its classes, right? Consider that. Now let's move on to question 3. What can we do while we wait for SAT, ACT, TOEFL, and IELTS test dates? Okay, that's easy. Prepare. That's what you can do. Now, I'm not saying that you have to prepare for all those exams at the same time. What I'm saying is you can start preparing your profile. So ask yourself, what better time is there to start working on your personal statement? Can you start preparing for any additional tests? Let's consider this. Right now, I know you can't take TOEFL. I know you can't take IELTS right now. But there's the English Duolingo test that you could use. You could start emailing your college reps and see what they think of the exam. Maybe that exam could suffice as the English proficiency requirement. But let's also keep in mind that ETS is now coming up with at-home versions of some of the exams. So soon you'll be able to take TOEFL from home, and you want to be ready for that. You want to know whether that's going to be an advantage or a disadvantage. You don't know if a safe environment at home will help you do better when you take the exam, or it might work as a distractor. Keep that in mind. Okay, now, how can I stay ahead of the game in terms of college applications during the quarantine? Well, it is difficult to think about staying ahead of the game when we're not so sure what the game is and what it will look like in the next couple of weeks or months. But it does allow me to tell you what you can start working on and what you should know about those things. So what I'm saying there, and how I want to connect it with my next point, is the personal statement. You can start working on your personal statement right now, and you can start drafting, maybe using the prompts that haven't changed for the Common App in the past 2 years. That's always a great starting point. And now when you do, I want you to consider that you can't use COVID-19 as an excuse for anything. Remember, we're all going through this. We're all in lockdown in our countries or in our houses, and there are people with extreme circumstances, right? If you're one of them, yes, you can use your story. People will relate. But if you're trying to use COVID-19 as an excuse for not working on your profile, for not taking exams, for your extracurriculars, remember, you can't use that. I've already talked to some of my students, and I know at least of a few that were involved in hackathons, in think tanks, and some other extracurriculars now that are trying to find solutions to all this pandemic, right? So be mindful that there are opportunities even in the midst of an ordeal, right? Let's see question 5. Will colleges put less attention on grades and standardized testing due to the virus? That's a good question. Now, if I were to take a stance on this, I don't think I would pay less attention to grades, right? And I say that because I believe that the future of education at some point will involve more blended learning. That is the combination of online and face-to-face, or face-to-face learning. So if they're considering that that's the future, then of course they want to see how you cope with changes, right? And these changes might be great indicators of your ability to adjust and adapt, right? So I wouldn't think that they would pay less attention to your grades. Again, if you have extreme circumstances, if I don't know, if ADD, ADHD, or whatever learning difference there could be affected your learning process, and some schools were a little behind on adapting to online learning or online teaching, then yes, you could write about it. But remember, again, we're all in this together, and we're having to cope with these conditions, right? So they want to see who's excelling, who's thinking outside the box, whose ability to adapt was the best, and all those elements, right? So if anything, I would think that they're focusing more on your grades They might pay less attention to standardized test dates if we don't have access to the same number of testing dates as before, right? That's the only difference. Now, if I could leave this thought with you guys, remember, quarantine time is not excuse time. So use it. Think outside the box, try to make the most of it. Think of different extracurriculars, right? The fact that your normal extracurriculars are on hiatus doesn't mean that you can't pursue other ones, right? And that's the type of thinking that schools want to see. In your opinion, question 6, sorry. In your opinion, how will acceptance rates change? For this particular question, I want to use an example. That's UNC. I believe that it announced that it was going to lower some of the standards for in-state students. And that's what I would expect for this coming semester, or at least for this coming year. Schools will make it more feasible for in-state students to enroll, and that's where we could see a big change. So that means that some of the acceptance rates might go up, but it might not affect everybody the same way. Now, seeing that international students are somewhat stuck with their F1 visa processes, then we might see an increase in the number of international students that schools are accepting, because it's a numbers game, right? If they think that fewer students will enroll, then they will accept more students in order to account for that difference. Question 7, will IB November exams change in any way? Well, I've been tracking what IB has been publishing, and I don't see, or at least I don't think of any reason, or I can't think of any reason for which those tests would change. I read in one of the announcements that students who were not okay with the conditions that were implemented for this coming May, they could decide to take their examinations in November. And because of that, I would imagine that they're saying, look, everything will go back to normal in November, and you'll be able to take your exams, get the combination of your schoolwork with your external examinations to get your IB diploma, right? So no, I don't think IB exams will change in the foreseeable future. Question 8. What do we recommend for students who have limited academic offerings in their schools do now in order to apply with a more competitive profile to universities abroad? Okay. Well, what would I say to that? I would say, as I have before, told you that admission officer, but that if I would say this, if you consider that the academic offering at your school is limited, then an admission officer might think the same way. And if the admission officer does, then it's up to you to change that, right? Because you can find more challenging courses or more challenging material online or somewhere else. So remember that you can go to Coursera, edX, MOOCs, your community college, find technical education, pursue other extracurriculars to find more challenging activities that will help you complement the academic offering that you deem to a certain extent limited. Question 9, do we think that universities will extend their application deadlines? Well, if you ask me, I don't think that at least application deadlines or early application deadlines for fall 2021 or 2022 will change. The deadlines that I have seen change are the ones for the class of 2020, right? As we all know, some of the changes have happened to at least the National College Decision Day, which used to be May 1st. And that's the change that we've seen. I think these changes are going to be short-lived, but that's assuming that things will go back to normal in the fall. So let's just remember that we have to be patient. We don't know how things are going to unfold. So be patient, pay attention to the news, and keep on checking the school's websites. Question 10. What is happening with APs? Well, that is one very positive change in my opinion, right? Because APs, or advanced placement exams, were exams that included a multiple choice section and a free response question section, right? Now, because of the lockdown, these tests are now being delivered virtually at the comfort of your own home, right? So what that means is that the test took away, College Board, took away the multiple choice section, and it's now only asking students to take a 45-minute section just made up of free response questions. And I believe that's a very positive change for the exam. Having said that, maybe the College Board has something in store, right? Maybe it could change SAT tests in the future. I don't know if they were to change them, then maybe if that would include more free response questions, who knows? But the thing is that the AP is keeping its schedule, right? Now I believe it added another round of tests in June. So you have two options to take your tests from home, right? Now, keep in mind that since you're taking tests from home, you might be asked to take a proctored version of those exams. And you want to become familiar with that interface before you start thinking about taking those exams. So if you need to know more, start doing your searches. Google ProctorU. For me, that's one of the best systems, and it will tell you some of the guidelines, right? Maybe you won't be able to use your Macintosh and you will be asked to use a Windows operating system. That might throw you off. So keep that in mind and make sure that you become familiar with the format before you take the test, right? Question 11. If I'm preparing to pay my college deposit this May to secure my spot for fall 2020, what should I know? Well, I was mentioning that earlier, right? We have the college decision day, which usually takes place on May 1st after senior high school students have been given their chances to go to their admitted days or preview days and made up their minds about the schools, right? So in this case, since those admitted days have been canceled, I know that some schools have pushed back their decision day to June 1st. Not all of them, right? So remember, check your websites. Make sure that your school did or your school didn't. You don't want to assume anything. So they're giving students, I think, a bigger window of time, maybe considering that they'll be able to visit in May so that they can make their deposit on June 1st. That's the one thing I would consider. But if you're an international student, I want you to pay attention to the visa process, because at least I know for a fact that those visa processes have been put on hold indefinitely. And without a visa, you won't be able to go to the States, and that might include taking a semester online, or at least your first semester online. I don't know if you want to do that, right? So just keep those two in mind, the decision day and the visa process. And the last question, question 12, if I'm starting college this fall, will I have to take my first semester online? Well, that is certainly a possibility. I know that school officials are not really talking about it, but they know. They know that it's a possibility. Now, if that's a possibility, you want to check with your school to see if they're offering deferrals, at least for this particular scenario. Some schools don't, but there will be extreme circumstances, right? If you're an international student, you might not be able to process your visa in time, so you might be allowed to use that deferral, right? Now, I know that public health officials, or at least some consultants for particular schools, think that business will be back to its usual in the fall. So schools are preparing for just a normal semester, but we don't really know what's going to happen, right? So you want to start preparing. What could I tell you if that's your case, right? Or if you're thinking what you could do in the meantime? I would give you the following steps. 1, check your school's website for those deferrals. 2, check your school's deadline for that deposit. 3, check your deadline for that deferral, or at least for that for submitting the deferral request letter. Then I would start preparing that deferral letter, right? Because you want to have good and valid reasons for it. I would start a debate with my family to see if I would consider a gap year or maybe a gap semester, and I would start planning for it. It's better to have a plan to not have anything at all, because right now you can control the situation. You can have a plan for what happens next, and when new things come out and you have your backup plans, then you have more options, and that's always, at least in my opinion, a lot better. After that, I would try to create an informed debate as to whether you would consider online learning, or you would need or you would actually benefit from your physical presence in school, right? For that first semester at least, and maybe for making friends or whatever you want to consider for that. And then I would try to talk to the entire family about those 3 points: the deferral, the gap year, and online learning. And from there, I would try to focus on making a rational decision, because I believe that all of our emotions are running high, and it is important to keep a leveled head in order to make the best decision for your future.